Cool. Well, thank you all for joining. I'm excited to talk to you about Figma. Tisha, there is a dad joke here. Figma is great. It lets us take a figment of our imagination, kind of what we're thinking, and we want to code. It makes it a lot easier to do so by designing it out first. And
Nice.
And you can thank that for Phil. He gave the idea. but it does a really good job at making that initial process of design, that planning and strategy stage, a lot easier to do and a lot more collaborative before we jump into code. So what we're going to be talking about today is a whole bunch of things. And don't feel worried, especially if you're new to any sort of design program or any of these concepts. We are going over quite a bit from the basics to some more complex and involved processes. But that's okay. I kind of want to just show you what's available and what's out there. And if you'll notice on most of the slides, there's a resources button here. And I'm going to send out this link afterwards, this Figma link. And it has these various articles and YouTube videos that I found helpful, kind of going through my own design journey, that breaks down in greater detail a lot of these subjects. So you can take a deeper dive later on if there's something that doesn't quite make sense. And I'll pause every once in a while and answer any questions, or we can also talk at the end if there's anything that comes up. I'm happy to do so. So first of all, we're going to talk about what is Figma and kind of get a better understanding of just the platform itself and what its uses are for. And then we're going to talk about how do we get started with it. It's a really easy process. We'll cover raster versus vector file formats and programs. And we'll take a look at the toolbar, the contextual properties panel, and the layers panel. As those are three of the main areas of Figma, so we can understand what are the tools at our disposal. And then we're going to start talking about some really cool functionality and features that Figma offers, such as layout grids and constraints. And understanding the differences between groups, frames, components, and auto layouts and why we love them. We're going to do a design demo, pulling together all these tools and concepts and create something utilizing those, but also plugins and the Font Awesome library and design systems to show how can we sort of speed up that process and work really efficiently. And then lastly, we're going to look at exporting assets, whether it's for our own code or sharing our Figma design with other developers, with designers, and even in our portfolios. So what is Figma? It's a lot of things, but in essence, it's a design platform. It's very similar to, if you're familiar with Photoshop or Illustrator or Sketch, it's a way to create wireframes and prototypes, but really focused on digital products. Not something we would necessarily print, but websites and apps, making that conceptual stage more visual. Figma itself is awesome for a lot of different reasons. One is it's actually browser-based, so you can open up Safari or Chrome and get an interface very similar to what we're seeing here with all the tools. It has a downloadable app as well, which is what I'm using, but that's completely optional. It also does a really good job at allowing people to work together. So everything, there actually isn't any files. There are, but you don't actually have to use them. That's sort of a secondary feature. Everything lives sort of online, and it's all updated in real time. So what that means is you don't have to actually save anything ever. As soon as I move something, it's saved. And it's collaborative, so other designers or developers can jump in on this file, and you can even see their cursors, and I can be moving this around and doing something like this. And for example, Tisha or Joey can jump in here and start moving around, moving things like this. And we can be designing together at the same time and see each other's updates, which is really awesome, especially in this sort of social distancing, work distancing world that we're in right now, where we can't be together. It's really helpful in that. And it handles state change really well. So I can undo design stuff that I'm doing here, but it won't affect anyone else who's working on the same artboard or the same project. It does a really good job at handling components, which we'll talk a lot about. It's very similar to React components that we've been learning. And it manages styles really well, which we're going to talk about more in a couple of minutes. And it's a really good jumpstart for development. So it's a way that we can actually design something out and then export out CSS or at least the start of CSS, and assets that are sized really well. And that way we're not starting from scratch when we're jumping into code. So getting up and running with Figma is actually really simple. It's one of probably the easiest programs I've ever just jumped into. Like I said, there is a downloadable app, which I have a link for here, but again, it's completely optional. And the tutorials on their site, which is help.figma.com, are really friendly and accessible. They're broken out really well. And for a deeper look, designcode.io has some really great, has a really great course on creating a design system, which goes into a lot of the fundamentals of using the platform. But before you even jump into any of that, creating an account is incredibly simple. So I'm going to see if I can show you a little under 30-second demo I have of signing up for an account yesterday. Here we go. So hit the sign up button, email, password, hit create account. It's just going to ask for a name. It's going to ask me for what kind of work I'm going to do. Agree to its terms, press create account, and that's it. The longest part of this GIF is waiting for my browser and internet to load and just getting the account set up. But at this point, we're ready to go. All the tools and features are there, and it's completely free. Okay, so before we jump into the actual tools, I wanted to take a second to talk about raster and vector. Has anybody heard of these terms before?
Yeah, like vector is like I guess less pixelated, and raster is more pixelated.
That's awesome. Very, 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 very. It's a good description of it. So, looking at the two images here, we have a raster circle here and a vector circle here, and zooming all the way out, they look very similar. It's almost impossible to tell the difference. But as Joey just mentioned, there is a difference. Raster is made up of pixels. So I'm going to use the keyboard key Z, which is going to give me a magnifying glass. And I'm going to click and drag a selection here, which is one of the many ways to zoom. And as I zoom in, check out the edge of this circle. See how pixelated it is. I'm going to zoom in even more. We start seeing a degradation in this shape. Now, as an alternative, I'm going to hold Command down on the Mac and Control on the PC, and I'm going to scroll out with my mouse, which is another way to zoom out. And I'm going to come over and reverse that action. So I'm going to hold Command down and scroll in. And let's look at the vector shape. Look how there's no degradation in the quality. As I zoom all the way in, it's completely sharp this entire time. Now, this is a really important fundamental concept with working with graphics and images. Even if you're not necessarily going to be doing that much design, you're going to find imagery, and graphics are going to come into play with even as a developer. And as Joe alluded to, raster images or files are based around pixels. So the more pixels that we have, the higher quality the image is going to be. But on the downside, the larger the file size is. Vector, on the other hand, doesn't deal with pixels at all. It's completely based around algorithms. I believe that the technology behind it is called PostScript. Don't quote me on that. I maybe just incorrect, but it's basically using algorithms and between points to figure out what does that shape look like. And that translates over to files. So for example, a JPEG or a PNG is a raster-based file, whereas we have something called an SVG as an example of one, which is a vector-based file. And the SVG will be many times smaller than that JPEG file, which oftentimes there's that question of, well, why don't I use vector file formats for everything? That's because raster it's basically the right tool for their job. So if we're working with imagery, like for example, photographs or really complex illustrations where there's gradations of color and shading, raster, because there's actually pixels and because there was sort of that fading you saw, pixels does a great job of gradually changing color. So if you have like a sunset, for example, you'll see a smooth transition between one color to the next. Whereas vector, because it is just the way the algorithms work, it's looking more for block color. So you'll notice there's actually gonna be color bars that'll appear as it's trying to move from one color to the next. So a big a hero image is, or a picture, a profile picture of somebody is still a great option to use a well-optimized photo, a raster photo, maybe served as a JPEG. But a logo, something with block shapes like an icon, is really good to use a vector file format. And that's really what it's meant for. I found this really good description called, see if I can jump to it here. So paint with raster and draw with vector. When you're creating, just think about it as almost like a watercolor. You have all these different colors coming together, and it's kind of complex in how it is. That's probably a good time to use something that's a raster based versus a vector based. Think more like line art. Now, Figma itself is actually a vector program. It can handle raster imagery. So you can bring an image into it, and it can do actually some raster effects where we're changing brightness and contrast and things like that. But fundamentally, it's actually not meant for that. And so it's better to use a program like Photoshop, which is more of a raster program. It can handle raster and vector, but it does a really good job of optimizing imagery, or using something like Tiny PNG that we've used in class before to optimize the images first, get them to a good file size, then bring them into Figma to put into our layout and craft it to what we're going to try to code. So actually, before I move on here, is there any questions so far?
Not yet, but I do have one that I think you might answer momentarily.
Cool, no worries. So let's take a look at sort of the tools that we have at our disposal with Figma. I'm not going to go through everything, but I kind of want to give an overview at least of the main ones. One of the coolest parts about Figma, and I think is the easiest to jump into as someone who maybe isn't in the design world, is it's very clean, and it's almost as powerful as you want it to be. Consider this layout we have here, where we have these tools up here, we have a panel on the left or right, and a panel on the left. And then let's compare it to Photoshop. And Photoshop is an awesome program, but check out how many tools we have in our disposal with multiple tools. Here we have all sorts of panels. These are just some. We can add many, many more. And it can be a little bit overwhelming, even for a designer, to jump in and see, like, what do I do first? There's so many options. Figma does a really good job of simplifying what it does. So it's a little bit less overwhelming to work with, and then intelligently show you settings and tools as you need them, which we'll go over in a little bit. But first, let's take a look at the top left. So, excuse me, our main tool is the move tool. And like its name, you can basically click on something, click and drag and move it around. Pretty simple. It's one of the main things that we'll do to compose items. And I'm going to create a quick little box here. And the move tool can also be used to resize things. So make it tall or wide, which is cool. We also have, under the move tool, the scale tool. Now, I can kind of scale this up and down with the regular move tool by holding shift, but consider, let's say we are making a button, and we have this text in here, and this is looking fine, but it's maybe a little bit small. So if I take these two and I use the move tool, the box is getting bigger, but the text is staying the same size. Now, there are actually better ways of doing what I'm about to show you, but it's good to know that this tool exists, just because there are certain situations where the other ways of enlarging text don't work, or are not as easy to work. But if I grab the move tool, which is either under the scale tool, which is under the move panel, or I can click K, and I select both of them, it scales it up. Now the font size is getting a lot bigger. Probably a better way of doing this in most cases is actually just increasing the font size, because it's going to be more accurate. But sometimes you have really complex shapes and and text and all sorts of things coming together, and you need a quick way to just expand it. So it's available, it's there. And I like to point it out because sometimes we expect the move tool to do that, and it can be frustrating when it doesn't. When in doubt, go to the scale tool. Next to it, we have the frame. It's this sort of hashtag looking thing, icon up here. Now, I'll talk more about frames in a little bit. It's another sort of fundamental concept that can be translated over to other design programs in the future if you ever go to like Photoshop or anything like that. But Figma has sort of its own spin on it. But essentially, a frame is an element, like so, that can accept colors. We can actually put other elements inside of it. So you can see I have this box, but as soon as I move it in and kind of it crops it off. And it has a lot more to do with it, but I'll talk about it in a little bit once we've gone a little further. The next item is the shape tool. And within the shape tool, there's multiple types of shapes we can create, but this is sort of the bread and butter. This is how we're going to create nav bars and cards and all sorts of things. Really, honestly, with just this simple rectangle or a circle or a line. And while they seem fairly simple, they can get quite complex and really robust as we add in things like we add a fill in. So maybe we change the color, then we can add a border radius or a border and add a stroke to it. And then maybe we give it an effect like a drop shadow and in CSS the box shadow, and do all sorts of things to make it unique. And because they're all vector, we can go ahead and really jump into those points and create really unique shapes from this. Now, the pen tool is probably the most complex out of all of these. And it's something that is very powerful that doesn't actually originate with Figma. I believe it was Illustrator, an Adobe software that pioneered it. I could be wrong, but it's in almost all the Adobe programs. After Effects, Illustrator, InDesign, Photoshop all have a pen tool. I believe other manufacturers of software also have it, but a pen tool is a really powerful way of custom creating shapes using points and making Bezier curves with them, and lets us get really creative with fill there with our shapes and how we edit shapes. So coming in, being able to adjust the curve or something can be really helpful at times, even if we're not creating a custom shape, but just coming in and modifying an existing one can be really helpful. And then next we have text, and text is what it sounds like, is a way for us to create text. I can hit the T button on the keyboard, and that's going to bring up the text, and I can type and create a bounding box and do all sorts of text related items. We'll talk more about the panel on the right, the contextual panel, and in a little bit, but it has all these different properties to stylize the text. So I can, reduce down the line height. Right now I have padding. I have sort of like margin bottom going on, but I can reduce that and increase the, in print we call it tracking. I believe in CSS it's letter spacing. Font size, which is really the best way of increasing and playing around with font size. But all that happens with the text tool. And if we look at it, we can actually break out the tools into categories. So navigation or sort of composition can happen with this move tool. Frame is sort of, it's a creation tool, but it's really more for almost like guidelines. But our creation tools are really just these three: creating shapes, modifying shapes, and creating text. That's really it. Our last two tools are the move and comment. So move is this hand icon up here. We can click on it on the hand. excuse me, we can click on the hand tool, or we can hold the space bar down, and this lets us pan around our artboard. So combining it with zooming in and zooming out, and holding the space bar down, clicking and dragging lets us really fluidly get between different designs that we have. And then lastly, this comment tool is one of the most, for me, one of the most helpful features with Figma for collaboration. So if I hit C, or I can click up here, I can actually drop a pin anywhere I want. So let's say right on this icon and add a comment. And now I have a comment here that appears also in this menu on the right. And anybody who is signed in to Figma and has an account can actually see this comment, and they can go ahead and respond to that comment as well. I can, if I had other people on my account, I can even tag people in it, and they'd get an email saying that there's a comment. And this is really helpful when you're working with a team, whether it's fellow developers or you're working with a designer, and maybe they created this really beautiful design, but you have questions on how's the functionality work? What are, you know, we have this great button here, but where does that actually link to? And the designer can actually come in and drop a link, so that way you're not cluttering up the design with things on the side and arrows pointing places. It's, you know, once we get out of the comment tool, it goes away. But as soon as we go back in, we get all these pins that we can have meaningful conversations in. And then we can also resolve them, so they kind of become like issues in GitHub, where once it's done, it goes away. Is there any questions before I go forward?
You're probably going to address it, G, but how do you add a collaborator?
Sure. So there are a whole section here. Here we go. So at a high level, the way Figma works is there's a team. So right now my team is called Gedalya Krycer, and a team can have members on it. So you can add members. Now Figma is free for up to 2 members and 2 projects. So taking sort of a high level look again, team is sort of your overall repository. That's your account. But within a team, you can have projects. Within a project, you can have files. These are Figma files. And what we were looking at was a Figma file. This is where the actual designs live. Now you can add to different projects or files different people. They can be what is called viewers. So for example, if I want to share this, I can invite somebody here and they can be just a viewer, which means they can't click and drag. And when I send this link out, everyone will be viewers. Or I can add an editor. And an editor allows you to actually click and modify things like I was doing before. With the free account, you can have 2 editors, I believe. Once you start paying, and I believe it's like $14 or somewhere in that range to add another editor. And then that editor becomes, they can, if you decide to share, can access any of those projects.
That's cool.
For sure. Any other questions?
I had one, Gedalya, and it might be a very silly question, but I'm a little confused on this.
No silly questions. Go for it.
You have a project open. So right now you have this project open, and that's how you are seeing all the tools on the left-hand side?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we would need, in order to see what you're seeing, we would need a project open.
That's correct.
Okay.
It may be worth also saying that because I'm an editor, I can see this. If I were to share with you this file and you weren't editor on my account, you would only see, and you were also signed in, you would see the hand tool and you would see the comment tool. If you weren't signed in at all, I believe you would only see the hand tool. But as an editor, that's why I'm able to see all of this. It also may look different on the browser. Some of this will go away and appear under other menus.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, thank you for that clarification.
Of course.
So this is the app itself, right? This is the app version of it.
Correct.
Would the online version look the same, or would it
very similar?
Look a bit different?
Sure, I'll show it to you here. Open up a non-incognito. Go to Figma. So this is the online version. And that's cool. As you can see, left and right side look exactly the same. The toolbar up here looks very similar. I don't have my tabs up here, but I can still navigate, and they will, some of that will appear as I click on more things, but some of those, for example, instead of having the little Figma icon up here, I have a back to files icon up in the menu.
Okay.
But essentially this all works the same. And you can even see, hey, there's I'm signed in on that other account, and there's my arrow, my little cursor there for collaboration.
That's cool.
And actually here I can show you too. So from a non-signed in account, actually not even having an account, this is just what the public would see. So now I just have that hand tool. I can drag, I can zoom in and out, but I have nothing else. I can click on other people's icons. So for example, I can look at my profile, and it's going to zoom me in to what I'm looking at. So if you're presenting to somebody, you can click on their icon, and then as they drag and move, this frame will move with them. So you can kind of lock onto their camera, which is really helpful for like walkthroughs.
All right.
Cool. So then moving on to the right, we have this really powerful panel that gives us contextual properties. I think in the latest version of Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign, they started building some of this into it as well. But Figma's been doing it for quite some time. It's one of the ways that we can have sort of minimal amounts of settings available, but still have them accessible when we need them. So for example, when I'm not clicking on anything, kind of in this little box representation here, I can see my artboard's background color. I can see styles, which we'll talk about in a little bit. I can see export option, and that's all under the design panel here. And that's basically it. We also have a prototype panel, which we're not going to cover too much or really at all here. It's a whole conversation on itself. It's really powerful and awesome, but not necessarily the most helpful for what we're trying to do in class. And we have a code section, which we'll talk about towards the end. But that's all we're seeing without clicking on anything. But notice when I jump into a shape and click on a shape, that changes. Now I start getting spacing and border radius and width and height properties. I have something called constraints, which we'll talk about in a little bit. I have layer options. I have fill, stroke effects, all these different things that would help me update this shape. When I click on text, that changes. We still have constraints because that's applicable to text elements, but we now have a text panel, which has all these different, options for alignment, for within the border, within the text bounding box, we have alignment as well. So we can do left, the center, and right align, but we can also vertically align it based on certain fonts, how they're built. Some of them write higher than others. So we can adjust some of that. And then we can even click on this little icon here and get even more stuff like underlines and capital and little previews of what that's going to look like, depending on the font. Some font files, for example, I think it's called OTF fonts, have a lot more information than, I believe it's called TTF fonts. So depending on what that font is that you're working with, more of these options will be shown. But for the most part, the bread and butter is what we're seeing up here. So if you ever can't find something, it's most likely you were looking for something that is contextual, and it's just a matter of clicking on that correct item and the information will show up. Now, excuse me, the layer panel is on the left, and layers is one of those fundamental design concepts for design software concepts. that will, whether you're using Figma or Sketch or Photoshop, will sort of translate to all those programs. And of course, Figma has a couple of twists on it for their component files or component layers. But for the most part, it stays the same. So, excuse me. What layers are is a way that we can represent hierarchy with what we're seeing on the page. So we're looking at a 2D representation of what we're seeing, but in reality, if I create a shape, put it here, it covers this image. It's actually a 3D space that we're looking at. But if I send it all the way to the back, it now goes below that text. And it can be hard to sort of represent what is above and what is below items without a layer panel. That's where we can see here this tree of information that shows how are our layers structured. So we're taking a look at this little design on the right. Excuse me. I'm going to blow it up on our left as well. So it's going to be this section here, and it's essentially this little graphic representation here. So at the offset, we have something called a frame. Now, kind of similar to layers across multiple design programs, there's something called an artboard. Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign call them artboards. After Effects calls them a stage. Figma calls it a frame. But essentially, it's the working space for your design. It's what we're seeing inside of this purple shape. And it's what, when we export something, where the art's going to be. So if you think about like you're making a line art drawing on paper, and you put that paper on a table, everything on that paper is going to come with it, and that's going to be the drawing you're making. But if you spill some paint on the left and you have some stickers on the right on the table, that's available for you to access, and it's all there. But as soon as you pick that piece of paper up, that doesn't matter anymore. It's just about what's on the paper. And that's kind of how artboards work within design software. So Figma calls them frames. The reason is that frames are actually an element that can be utilized within each other. So you can have essentially an artboard within an artboard, which is really powerful. And we'll see some sort of use cases for that. But for our concern is it's a thing that's holding all these other elements. So on that second level, we have a component, which is this sort of little logo here. And we have a text right next to it. So these items are higher up in the hierarchy than, for example, this text element, which is this guy right here. You can kind of see as I drag it over, it's on top of it. Next, we have a group, and a group is a way, though, it's almost like a folder we can create to hold various elements. So if I click on this group, also represented here, they all kind of come with them. And it's a great way of consolidating your files, your elements within the file, so you can easily drag them around, but also to clean up and segment out your layer panel. And we have another group here that has an image, text, and all that kind of comes together to create a design. And if you do this correctly and put some thought into it, this actually kind of becomes your HTML structure. So think about it as your main tag up here, and then you have a text, you have maybe an H1, and then you have a div, which is this group, and that has an H2 with some body copy and shape. And then you have another div here, or a section element, and you're kind of pre-planning your code right inside your design, which can be helpful. It's also good for designers who I found this really helpful when I started learning HTML, is that I was kind of already used to how HTML is structured because it's naturally built into the processes of these design softwares, and vice versa, of course.
Can you rename those groups and components?
Absolutely. So everything here can be renamed, and it honestly should be. So for example, text will most of the time actually just pull in whatever the text is, and logo is helpful. That's a good name so we can see. Group, maybe this is actually the article, so I'm pressing Command R to get into this layer panel. I can also double click into it, and we'll call this article. And then this body copy here. I'm going to move it down just for organization's sake, but maybe we want to just call this body and call this headline. And maybe this rectangle is called background. Depending on who you're working with, whether it's for yourself or with somebody else, how deep you want to go with naming things is kind of up to you. I recommend, it can be a little bit, it can get a little time consuming if you have multiple elements to really go in and name everything. What I would suggest is naming your groups, because when you're digging around to find that element, it can be helpful to see what group you're talking about. Frame doesn't really say a whole lot, but if I say, you know, blog mockup, and I'm looking at this parent frame here called layer panel with all these different elements going on, it's a lot easier to find something than just called group 19. I see blog mockup. It also comes into play later on where we can actually export this whole thing out and this becomes the file name. There's also, without getting too deep into it, because it's a whole conversation in itself, we can actually create subgroups within Figma by putting in forward slashes. So for example, I may have something called blog and then put a forward slash, and now mockup lives within blog. And actually, you know, I'll show you an example later on when we get to the design part of how that kind of comes into effect. But it is something that's worth spending a little bit of time up front to properly name things, and as you're designing, name things, because it can affect other things. So it's a great question, Tisha. Any other questions before I move forward?
Yeah, let's say you like make a mistake and you want to relayer something. Could you just easily do that?
Sure. So you can hit Command Z or Control Z, and that'll go back a state. There's also a whole thing in Figma. Let me see if I can find it. Versions is what I'm looking for here.
Would it be like a history panel with like Photoshop, something along those lines?
There is actually here. Yep, here we go. So Photoshop does, I think, a better job of really saving every single movement than Figma does. You can go back, I'm pretty sure it's infinitely, but if not very close to that, with Command Z. But Figma does offer this version control. So it is actually grabbing at specific points the whole design, the whole project that you can jump back to. And you can save versions if you're working on something really critical and you kind of almost want to do like a git commit. You can go to File and save a version. And if you really want to go, so for a real world example, let's say you're working on a wireframe, and then, so a wireframe is sort of a black and white representation of a website, but then you want to go into the prototype or high fidelity mockup stage, and that's sort of the pixel perfect imagery and color design of your page. There's something that's called components within Figma, which we're soon going to talk more in depth about, but components can affect both versions of that design because of the way they work. So maybe you want to save a hard copy of that wireframe before you start designing something else with the high fidelity mockup. So you can actually save a physical file called a .fig, and that downloads an actual physical file that's separate from the cloud that can be uploaded to another Figma account if you want in the future to really back up that change. Cool. Any other questions with layer panel? All right. Cool. So I've been kind of inferring all these items, but we've got a lot of things in Figma that kind of are in this group category. So we have groups, we got frames, we got components, we got auto layout, and we love them. They're awesome. They're kind of what makes design softwares in general really powerful, but especially these last two, they make Figma really powerful. So if you look at these two shapes here, kind of as we saw, these are separate elements in our last example, but we can go ahead and create them into a group. So if I click and drag, this is separate from the box, but I can select them, and on a Mac, I can hit Command G or Control G on Windows. I can also come in and select both of them and right click and go to group selection. And now when I click and drag, I have a group, and I can rename this group and call it, for example, shapes, and that's great. And it's now really nicely organized. I can undo this group. Well, actually, before I undo it, I'll just show you what a group looks like. It's, excuse me, as this sort of bordered dotted outline here, but it contains those elements within it, so I can still access them. I can always, excuse me, drag one out, and now this one is not part of the group, and even though there's only one element, this is still a group with one element. Command Z to go back. But if I want to completely dissolve the group, I can hit Command or Control Shift G to dissolve it, or I can right click and go to ungroup. And now they're no longer a group. As I mentioned, frames are more powerful. They are essentially our groups, but they have a lot of different settings that we can use with them. So the artboard we're looking at right now is actually a frame. This is a frame here, and I can create another frame by coming up to the frame tool and drawing out a frame, and it creates it right here. And if I click and drag on it, this is now inside of that frame. So if I select the frame, this moves with it. I can select another item, click and drag in it, maybe put this over to the side so it's cropped. And now this is contained within a frame. Similarly, I can just drag all this over and this is contained in a frame. Frames don't have to constrain. I can have them not clip content, and now this is technically still in the frame, but off. It's not really an often case when you would actually use that, so I would just keep clip content on. But frames are really powerful because we can do things like constraints. Groups can take constraints as well, but frames do a better job at it, I found. And I'll talk a lot more about constraints in a little bit, but essentially they're ways to pin things. And frames do a great job of that. Frames can take things like fills. So I can create a background for this, and it's all nicely contained in there. Frames, while they are upgraded versions in many ways of groups, they are not always good to use because, for example, I have this shape here, and as I drag it on top, all of a sudden it becomes part of that frame, and that can get kind of annoying when you don't intend that to happen. So if you're looking purely to think about almost like maybe even like divs for groups, like if you just want to structure things and you're not trying to do anything special with them, you're just purely trying to segment things, groups are probably a good option to use because I'm going to dissolve this frame by actually just ungrouping it. Same command as with a regular group. But let's say I have this group here, I'll group it. Now it's a group, and I take another element and I drag it on top. It's completely ignoring that group. Nothing's happening. So it's a great way of segmenting things together, off from each other, without actually affecting them like a frame would. Now, excuse me, there is something called a component. Components are really similar to a React components that we've been talking about. Essentially, we have a component, which is it's essentially a group. It's also a frame, so it's a combination of these two. And let's create one real quick. So I'm going to grab this box here and make it into a component. And a component is signified by these 4 diamonds up here. When I click on it, you'll see the 4 purple diamonds on the left, and it's a little bit hard to see on the green. I'll move it out here. This gets, let me make this sort of white. This gets a purple bounding box. So purple signifies a component. Now, what's
Hey,
cool?
Gedalya, I had a question about that
Sure, go for it.
really quick. You're seeing that on your screen because you're in the app? Or you're in the, yeah, you're in the app, okay. You won't see it in the browser then.
You will see it in the browser if you have a account setup. So if I come over to, let's see. Let's see here. If I come over to the browser one, and I'll jump into this one, I could still create a shape, and there's the component there. Now you won't see it if you don't click on anything. It's contextual as well. So I got to first click on a shape or a text element, and then we'll see the component icon show up.
Okay, cool.
Cool. All right. So cool. So we have our component here. So what does it do? So the way to use a component is you actually make a copy of it. And now this is the component here. This is the parent essentially. But if you'll notice on the left, the child that we just copied from now has a large empty diamond. And this is called an instance. So think about it as the same thing as React. You have a component file, and then let's say you make a nav bar. You can actually bring that nav bar into other components or other pages, and it is tied to that parent component. So we can go ahead and make a couple other copies of this. These are all instances tied to this master component. And then if we want to change the color of this component, all of a sudden the colors change here. And it's a really powerful way of creating user interfaces without manually creating multiple items. So for example, let's make a cool little grid here. Now check how these are not equally spaced, but I have a little button here, or I can come up here and I can distribute the space horizontally. I can make another little grid here. Oh, no, let me restart because I made some duplicates by accident. So I'm gonna drag one out, and I'm gonna press Command D to replicate that space exactly. I'm gonna come down here, drag this out, press Command D, go. Maybe I want to actually, selecting all of them, I can adjust the padding and margin in between. Cool, so we got a nice little grid here. Now, I'm gonna take this circle, and maybe this is an image. I'm gonna bring that into our component, size it up, that looks good. Cool. Now, let's say we wanted to add an icon into here, to our little cards we're creating. So I'm just gonna grab another shape and bring in this little rectangle here, and I'm gonna bring in a second icon. So let's make a little star.
Can I ask a quick question, Gedalya?
Sure, go for it.
Are these the sizing like live pixels? So these are actually what they'd look like on a monitor screen
Charlotte.
when they're on page.
Absolutely. Yeah, so this is pixel perfect representation. So this is 72 by 72. I'm zoomed in, so if I can hit Command 0, that's 100% zoom now on a 5K monitor. And that's actually a great question. We're going to talk about grids in a little bit, and kind of how do we size our artboards up, our frames up, to best match what we're going to code in a little bit.
Sweet, thank you.
Of course. So going back to this, let's say we have multiple icons. So I'm actually going to make these icons into components themselves, because instances of components, the children of components, inherit a lot of really great features and power from those components. So for example, let's say we got these two icons here. I'm going to make a copy of it, an instance, because components actually can't go into other components. If I take this component, nothing's going to happen. But an instance can. So I'd take this instance, check out how it got added there, right? And let's take it a step further as well. We talked a little bit before, we had a question from Tisha about file naming. So if I take this file name here and I change it from polygon1, and I'm going to call it icons. And I'm going to give it a /, and I'm going to call this triangle, right? And then I'm going to go to this one, give it the same name, icons, give it a /, and call it star. Now, instances can look for other components. So on the right, my contextual menu changed to where I see triangle now. And if I go to presentation, which is this board, and go under groups, I have a spelling, I have an uppercase here, so that's important. I'm gonna make sure this is named uppercase I. There we go. So if I go back here, go to presentations and go to icons, check out how both those.
Think about. Charlie. Oh, wait, where'd you go? There she is. Where'd you go? Charlie. Peekaboo.
Hey, you
like someone's-
TJ.
Gee, you're not muted.
You're unmuted. Didn't realize I was unmuted. Sorry, guys.
Oh, good. It's not fun. So check out how the icons actually now are in a sort of a subgroup because we just named them icons / some name. And Figma is really intelligent about that. So without digging into all this stuff, I can just click on the instance and it's going to show me what was another icon part of that group. So I can actually hit star and check out how it switched those two instances out. Makes it really simple to kind of create these complex designs in a couple of steps by accurately setting up our components. And components are a really challenging and powerful concept. There's a resource link here, so if this kind of feels overwhelming, don't worry about it. There's a lot of great resources that Figma has on setting up components. But as you can see in a couple of quick steps, we've created a fairly complex layout that is easily updated. So imagine if this was a nav bar on multiple pages, and we can easily update this across the board. Now, this is actually a fairly recent update, maybe in the last, excuse me, couple months, maybe 6 months, something called auto layout. So going back to our button example, if let's say we create a shape on a button, I'm gonna make this 45 pixels height, which is 35 to 45 pixels is usually considered a easy enough zone to tap on a mobile phone. So it's usually a good start for a button. And I'm gonna take some text and call this earn more. I'm gonna size that down to maybe let's say 30 pixels, maybe 26, that looks about right. Put this in the middle. We will extend this out a little bit. Cool, and let's make this into a group. So we got our button. I can actually click on a group and go to selection colors, and it intelligently finds all the colors. So I can go ahead and change that background to something else. Maybe we want to have this be that purple and we make that white. I'm not actually clicking on those elements, but Figma can tell what's inside of it. Cool, so we have a nice little button there. But later on we discover we actually don't want to call this learn more, we want to call this submit. And notice that everything is kind of, I have all this space on the right, and then I got to go into this layer and sort of drag it out. I'm going to hold Alt down and get my grids so I can kind of see pixel space wise, like kind of what's going on here, and size that up, which it's fine, but it's a lot of steps for something that's really fairly simple. So instead, I can create what's called an auto layout. So holding Shift A or coming over to the right here to the auto layout, it creates a special group called a frame. It's signified by these two shapes here. And check out how it actually cropped it down and gave it padding all around. And what's cooler is, let's say, you know what, learn more really was what I wanted. It's figuring out how big it should make the frame and keeps that padding. And I can go in and adjust that padding here. So maybe I want to give this 23 pixels padding and left and right, and I want to give this 8 pixels padding top and bottom. I can do that really simply, and let's combine that with a component. So let me make another one of these and call this. Actually, let's make it into component first. And this is going to be our nav bar here, and I'm going to call this one. You know what? I did like let's call it sign up. And still some spacing here that's an issue. That's fine, because we can actually just make this into an auto layout and adjust the gutter between them. So maybe we want to give this 10 and then call this learn more. and I'm going to create an instance, and this is going to be on several pages. And then I realized, you know what? Sign up and log in. Login probably should go there. So log in. And now this has been live updated across the board. And one thing I forgot to mention about instances is they can't be changed within their scale and positioning. So I can't come in and actually drag this login. Like I could go in the component maybe and drag it. But I can change colors and text. So I can come in this one and call it create account and check how that changes, and this one doesn't change. But I could also come in here and move it and check out how the position's changed because I did in the master component. I can change the color as well. Like maybe this one is a yellow. And I realized, you know something, I don't like that. I want to reset it. So I can jump into that instance and reset it to be back to where the component is. So there's a lot of functionality that are shared between component and instances. There are some limitations as we saw, but overall they give it a lot of power. I know there was quite a bit to go over. Again, there's a resource link here. But was there any questions that immediately came up before we go forward?
Yeah, G, like, is there like preset sizes for like the frames or artboards? So like if you wanted to like iPhone 9 size, you can start, I guess, drafting your layout accordingly. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. That was a great question. So there is, if let's say I hit the A on the keyboard, which is the frame icon, you can see over here, we actually do have those presets set up. We got social media items even. So Instagram story is 1080 by 1920. So I created that. There's iPhones. We got iWatch, we got paper. I would highly recommend to never design anything print in Figma. It's not set up for that, but it's there. Tablets, iPhones. So absolutely, there are ways to have a good jumping off point. Any other questions?
I have another one, but it might be covering this later. And I'm sorry I kind of missed the first half of the class.
No worries.
But is this being live coded like in the back? So like you know, in CSS or whatever, you know what I mean? Like could we look at the code for it if you set a group up or a frame, something like that?
That's a great question. Kind of. We will actually cover at the end ways of pulling CSS out. I believe this whole thing is created on some level of JavaScript. I know that plugins are, which is something we'll talk about in a little bit, are JavaScript, and you can actually develop and code your own plugins and use it in Figma, and you can even actually submit it to what they're calling the community, so other people can use it. It's completely actually community driven. Figma may have plugins, but for the most part, it's developers just kind of creating stuff, and it's all using JavaScript. It is limited, so I'll show you kind of at the end what we can do with it, but short answer is yes, to an extent.
Cool.
Awesome. Cool. So the last sort of like major feature we'll cover before we go into a sort of design demo is layout grids and constraints. These are really two separate themes or concepts, but they work really well together. So layout grids, I don't know if you noticed, it's kind of hard to see on the screen share, but if I zoom all the way in, we kind of get this pixel grid here. This is actually a layout grid. I can turn that off by hitting on a Mac. It's Control G. And Tish and I were talking about this earlier. It's a very odd keyboard shortcut on Windows to get rid of a grid. But you can also, I believe it's in here somewhere, or you can come over to the panel on the right where it says grids and turn it off there, or I believe it's under view here. You can toggle off grids. There it is, show layout grids and turn them off. But what grids are ways that we can set up previews of margin padding columns and rows. Combining them with constraints. Constraints are ways that we can pin things. We can stretch them. We can do control how are things utilized in our report. So if we come over to the right in sort of this wireframe, we actually see a bootstrap grid here. And this is a layout grid that I've set up. So clicking on the frame, our contextual menu updates, and we can see this grid here. This grid is 12 columns. You can give it a color and opacity to make it stand out more or less. The type is stretch. There's various types and they're good for various situations. But stretch is a pretty good one to stick with for now. It automatically makes the width auto, and we can give it a margin. So there's always going to be 134 pixels on the left and right, and we can give it a gutter, which is the spaces between the columns. And what's cool about this, besides just helping us understand how do we align things and really get the sizing right, is Figma, while it's not completely responsive in terms of things will auto lay out as we move things around like stack, they will actually abide by responsive principles. So if I click and drag this, check out how the cards and the elements are sticking to that grid, which is really helpful if we're going from a tablet or a desktop layout to maybe a laptop or a desktop layout, which can be really powerful. And if we set this up correctly using constraints, we can actually get really complex layouts and resize them correctly. So let me see if I can find the original component. So clicking on an instance takes me to go to main component, which is this one here. Typically, and I'll show you later on, we actually want to keep this in a design system, but for this purpose, we have the component here, which is fine. But if I put another shape in here, like grab a circle, I'll throw a shape in here. And if I resize this, check out how that shape is stretching, which is not great. And I have this all over me, it's an image. It's all getting smushed and stretched, which is not great. But if I go here and click on it, I can actually go to constraints and pin it to the top and pin it to the left. And now, if I stretch this, check out how the shape is staying pinned there, which can be really helpful. I think I actually have it on the bottom footer. So it's a great idea to pin your footers, because if I click and drag and I want to add more cards or something else, I can just click and drag and that footer stays pinned to the bottom. There's a lot of different types of constraints that you can use with all sorts of settings here. It's really powerful. I definitely encourage to dig a little more into it if it looks interesting. It helped me design a lot faster because I was able to create really powerful components that worked in various situations. I can create a card as a component, but pin it correctly that it can be used on mobile, it can be used on desktop, I can resize it, and I don't have to create a whole new component or element for it. And we can see here we have a layout grid, another layout grid for mobile. One that you typically go with is a 2-column grid with 20 pixels of margin on either side, which can help with layout. And on this here, this is purely subjective. It's depending what framework you're using and kind of what you're designing for, this can change. But I found it easiest to have a 1500 pixel desktop artboard. So that's what this is, with a bootstrap grid of 1170 width for the desktop grid. So all 12 columns are about 1170 pixels. And then I like to design on a 375 pixel mobile artboard. It's really small, so it's helpful to figure out when things are going to break, because I can design things at an extreme and then kind of fix things in code later on when I get to those in-between breakpoints. And then the grid for that is 335. This can of course change on the design and the application, but it's potentially a good starting point. And there are, of course, resource links that dive deeper into that as well. Any questions around constraints or layout grids? Cool. All right. So almost towards the end, let's take a look at recreating a design, utilizing kind of these tools we just learned, and then also adding in plugins, pulling some icons from Font Awesome, and using a design system to really pull it all together. So we have a design here, and there's all sorts of elements, which are essentially components. We have a hero image. We have a filter bar that has components inside of it, a search component and a filter bar component. We have a card. And if you kind of think about this from React, it's essentially how we would set up a React app, right? We would map through the cards to create multiple versions of them. And we break out all these components and maybe put them in a team directory page. So we can do a very similar setup in Figma and just plan out our components. So here's the hero component, here's a team card, the filter search, the button group, pulling them together as a filtered bar, and then having them wrapped in a main. So our code is almost set up already in terms of strategy. And we can kind of figure out what is that going to look like on multiple page sizes and create some design solutions before we even get into the code and figure that out before we're spending too many hours debugging, right? So this will stack nicely, that's cool. Play around having, do we want this on top or on bottom? And seeing how that all plays out. Now, a really important and helpful sort of practice is to create something called a design system. This is a very simple one. They can get really large depending on the project, but it's essentially a repository of components and styles that are going to be used across this project, but maybe even multiple projects. So maybe you're creating you're working for a client that has 3 or 4 websites, and they have multiple emails, and instead of always setting up that header 1 and that header 2, the H1, H2, what if you created a style from it that can be shared across all those different elements? And what if they had a card that appears on multiple pages or navbar? Having that component live on a specific page can be really confusing at times because you can forget where it is. But if you have them in a design system, all your components live in one area, you know where to go to update them. So for example, the favicon and the logo is in our design system. And if I go ahead and, for whatever reason, the logo changed and I make that. Try to make that a different color. Let's see, oh, that's why. Unions are another cool concept that can be kind of annoying at times, but it's a really, if you ever worked with Illustrator, it's a way of bringing different images together, but let's change the color on this end. There we go. So it made it dark green, but check out how it updated everywhere, right? These aren't components. This header 1, header 2, 3, 4 body. And these colors aren't components either. They're another concept called a style. So in our contextual menu, let's say I create some text. I can add in a fill if I want, and I can add in a custom text, but there's also these 4 circles that appear in these menus. And these are our styles that we have set up. So I can just quickly apply a style and check out how, as I cycle through them, the font size changes. And if I want to change a color, I can create a style and select from my palette of colors. And let's say, you know what, BG lighter, I notice how I didn't call this blue, I called it BG lighter. That's because if the brand colors change to, let's say they now are going with red, I can go into my style here and go with a red, check out how that changed that red everywhere that it's being used, whether it's a component or just kind of out there somewhere. So it's a really powerful way of keeping track on where all your colors are, where all your fonts are, including effects. Like we can create a shadow, a box shadow here, and make that into a style by clicking on the style section, clicking on the plus button, giving it a name, card shadow, create style. And now we have a style that we can apply very easily to other elements. And what this does is when we start the project, we can actually just come to our styles here or here and set up our CSS document with all these different properties that are already pre-set up, making it a lot easier to jump into a program. So let's recreate this card here from scratch and kind of see what does it go into making a design when using all the different things we talked about. So I typically won't start off by creating a component right away. I like to just create a shape and group them together and then kind of get an idea of how it's looking before I componentize it. But it looks like this is probably around 3 columns. So we'll create a shape for the background. Maybe we want to call that card BG in our layers. And then it looks like it has a little border radius there. So we can come up here to the border radius and we give that a 5 pixel border radius, maybe 10. That looks pretty close. Cool. So now we have an image, a name, and a title, and some contact information separated by a line. So I'll put a circle in the middle for our image, and instead of giving it an image right now, I'm going to give it a image placeholder. So I'm clicking on the fill, going to solid, and I'm going to select image, which gives a little placeholder here. And I'll hold Option down on a Mac, or it's Alt on a Windows, and I'm just going to sort of get my sizing, or sorry, my margin and padding here, and sort of get this centered. I can also come over and center them with align tools. That looks pretty good. And then let's grab text. So I'm going to call this, there we go. I'm going to call this name. I'm not going to actually give it a name for now. I'm going to center it. Instead of an H1, I think this is, what is an H2? No, it's an oh yeah, H2. Yep. So I'll center that as well. And then we want a title. So we'll give this a title. And because I have my styles set up, it's very simple to just add things to it. Cool, that looks pretty good. Now I can go ahead and group everything at this point. And you know what, I'm actually gonna go ahead and create a frame. And because I'm creating a frame, I might as well just create a component. And I'm gonna start setting up constraints. So I'm gonna constrain this image to the top, and then constrain it to be centered. So ideally, if I start dragging, check out how the image is not moving. The name and title, I'm going to group those together. And the group, I'm going to pin to the top. And I'm going to pin it to be, top here. And I'm going to pin this to be left and right. So now, as I drag it up, it's going to be centered, but it's also going to let me type more because it's left and right, and still be pinned to the top there, which is nice. Then we're going to add a line in. So inside of our component, I'm going to create a line, and I'm actually going to just call this name and title. There we go. And then for this line, I'm going to set this to be pinned to the top as well, which it is. And I'm going to set this to, it actually doesn't matter if I do left or right and scale. They both, in this case, are the same thing, but I'll just call it left and right. And we just zoom all the way in to make sure it's pinned nice, it's aligned nicely, which it is. And I'm going to give this a stroke color of that lighter green. And actually at this point, I'll give this background, the background color, maybe something like that is pretty good. And we can go ahead and give these colors as well from our style guide. There we go. And I'll extend this down, but because I constrained everything, nothing's moving, which is nice. Maybe I'll actually give this a drop shadow as well. This is the card background. So I want to go to effect, give it a drop shadow, we'll adjust the blur. So I'm going to add 2 blurs to it. This is going to be the first blur, which is pretty wide. And that looks pretty good. And then I'm going to add another blur. And this one's going to be, the blur amount is not going to be as much. So it's going to be maybe a little closer in. And it's going to be a little harsher. And check out how it kind of gives it like a 3D look a little bit. How when you shine a light on something, things that are closer to the object are going to be a little bit harsher in the shadow. But when you expand out, the light expands out, it sort of blurs out. So that gives it a nice sort of tactile look. And you know, if I wanted to make this into a style for future use, I can easily come ahead and create that. It is worth noting that we can't stack styles. So if I created one style, I couldn't stack another one on top. So it's sort of choices to make. Okay, so our card's looking pretty good. Now we have the section here that has contact information and icons. So with React, there's this really cool library that Phil turned me on to, which is React Icons. It lets us pull in all sorts of really cool icons and import them. And one of the ones are font awesome icons. So Figma font awesome icons are an example of a vector file, which Figma handles really well. So we're going to actually download SVG files to work in our Figma document as representations of what we'll use. And when we code, we can just actually come in here and just find that icon and grab the code for it to import in React. So it's kind of, we get to use both libraries or both resources at the right time. So first icon we need is a pin. So I'm going to come here and let's see, it's either going to be map or pin. You can search for that. Oh, there it is. And it has a little download button here for an SVG. So I'll download that and go find my little, there it is. When I bring this into Figma, it actually creates a frame. So if we look at the file here, the layer here, there's a frame that has the icon in it. I'm actually going to dissolve that frame by Command-Shift-G to ungroup it. I'm going to call this, I'm going to componentize it and call it pin. Actually, no, I can call it icons because we already set that up before and call it pin. So now it's part of the icons group. And size this down with the move tool. And maybe let's give this our color here. Cool. So we got this here, and we also need a phone and we need an email. So we'll go to phone. And this one looks fine, so we'll download this one. And then we want email or mail, is probably what it's going to be called as well. Cool, we got this one. And then real quickly, we'll do the same process. I'm going to grab both of these, this one and this one, dissolve the frames, Command-Shift-G, or Command-Alt-G on a PC. Grab that. Now, because we already created a component, and let's see, this looks like it's 39 pixels height. I'm going to just grab both of these, lock their height and width to stay the same, and I'm going to make them 32 pixels. So we kind of size them quickly together, give them the correct color. And I can select both of these and go under components and create multiple components. So that way they're not formed into one. And now both of these become components. I can select both of them, press Command-R to rename the layers. And let me give them the start of the same name. So icon to rename them. And then I can come in to each one and just give them their unique names, like phone. And let's see this one. Oh, you know what? I dragged in the wrong one. We want the mail one. So dissolve, lock, resize, color, component, rename. Now we're back in business. So based on the sizes and sort of the widths of it all, they're kind of various sizes because even though the height is the same, the width is different. So we can fix that in a second. One way of kind of doing that is, well, let's sort of line them up and kind of eyeball it for now. So we can probably make something like that. Maybe this one like that, and this one. I'm just clicking the height and using the arrow keys to reduce in size. Cool, so now they're all components, and we're gonna make another component, one for the list, each list item. And again, thinking about HTML, we have sort of a UL element that's grabbing all these, but then we have an LI element for each list item. So I'm gonna grab some text and call this one New York, make sure it is left aligned. Give it our color. Drag out our, we don't want that one, we want a pin. Drag out our instance of the component, of the icon. So let's see, this is I can just see here, this is a body. So let's say, make sure we're using the body style, which we are. Okay, and this is giving us a really good sense of, I know this is 16 pixels, because that's how I set up the style. And by comparison now, this icon looks huge. So this is gonna help us size the icon correctly by seeing how big it matches with the text. So I can use it as a starting point. I can come to the component to actually resize it. So something like that looks pretty good. Now that I have a good size on this one, I can come in here and resize these to be kind of the same sort of feel, so one doesn't overpower the other. It looks okay for now. And then now that I have these, I can create a component out of this one. And I'm gonna pin the icon to the left and sort of center it vertically. I'm gonna pin this one. Actually, I'm gonna left and right pin this one and then center it vertically. Cool, so now I have a sort of a combo component. Call this one list. So now let's pull it all together. So grab a list item here, sort of align it to where it looks kind of good. Drag out two more. Now we have a phone number, so create a phone number. And we have an email. And then because these were components, we can jump into our instance and go to here, and it's actually pulling up the ones that apply to it. Figma understands that. So check out how this actually got worked. If I go to this one and go to the, I did the wrong one, so mail for this one and phone number for this one. There you go. So it's worked, which is not great. There's a lot of ways of getting around this. The reason why it's warped is we're taking the aspect ratio, the width and height of this one, and telling it, hey, because this is a component, go ahead and put all the other icons in at the same size and make them fit. But we don't want that because it doesn't look great. So because we now have auto layout, we can actually auto layout these components. And as a side effect, it fixes the width so they don't get messed up. And sizing is not super great. Some of this is for time's sake, it's probably fine for now. A simple way of sort of fixing this is just pushing out the text a little bit so it feels like these are centered more. In the code, we can go ahead and probably center that a little better. But for right now, we're getting spacing, so that's fine. So we got these, we got this. I can go ahead and group all these together. Oop, I don't want the background, I just want our list items. Okay, these are all nicely grouped. They're inside of our component. I will left and top, which is good. I'm going to constrain the frame to the content by this button here. So now the component frame is sized nicely. And if I click and drag, everything sort of stays where we want it, which is nice. So this is a pretty robust component now. And the last step is getting on the page and putting in content. So I'm going to put this component to the side here and then drag in. I'm going to turn our layouts on. And I'm going to drag one out and then do the Command D again to duplicate out the spacing. Now it looks like, what do we got here? I didn't do the spacing quite correct. That's fine. So we can go to our component, go to the columns again, and just resize this. So it's nicely spaced. That's great. Because it's constrained nicely, it'll all work. And then now I can move this one in to where it should be, select all of them, come up to here and click distribute horizontal spacing, and now everything's perfectly spaced. And I'm going to drag out another one, drag out another one. So now we have a pretty nice layout. However, we have images here, and we have names and titles. So ideally, we would have real names in images, but let's say we're just trying to mock this up and get a sense of it. We can use plugins to make this process really simple. So what I'm going to do is select all the images. I'm holding Command down or Control to get through the component and actually select the image. When you just click on a component, it's going to grab the whole thing. But if you want to select something really quickly within a component or a group or a frame, you can hold Command down. And now with everything selected, I'm going to go to plugins. So plugins are accessible by right-clicking and going to plugins. Or alternatively, you can hold Command / to get to your search, and you can search for a plugin. So the one I want is called avatars. So I can hit avatars, and it's going to auto-populate a bunch of free avatar pictures, which is pretty sweet. And maybe want some other avatars, I can rerun that plugin. So I can press Command Option P, and it's going to regenerate avatar pictures, which is nice. It's pulling it, I believe, from Unsplash. So it's kind of going as fast as the API goes. But, this is an example of sort of a JavaScript plugin that any one of us can probably create and using APIs. Cool. So title is going to be a little bit different. There isn't a great plugin that I have found so far, and maybe this is for someone to create here, that pulls in good sort of placeholder titles. But we could load in titles from a Google Sheet. There is a plugin from that where we set up a Google Sheet and run it through our components. But we can do names pretty nicely. So I'm going to grab all the names here. And they're actually, let's see real quick, there actually might be a, forget, there is a way to select all the same names. Select all with the same text, boom. Oh, you know what, I have names elsewhere, so we don't want to do that. But hey, if you ever want to do that, there is that option. So I'm going to go ahead and select all the names. Cool, and then I'm going to go back in and search for a plugin. Again, I could have right-clicked and gone to plugins, but and this one is, I forget what it's called. Place, name, random name generator. This is the one. So I can select male names, female names, both, first name, last name. Actually, probably a better thing to do is go through first by gender, so I can give an accurate name. So I'm going to select sorry, 1 second. The female names first. There we go. I think I got everybody. And I'm going to go to, we want full name, female, and it is giving us the names, and we'll fix this part in a second. But let's go to the men and select their names. And then I can run that plugin again, Command Option P, or P, or Control Alt P. And I can go to male full name. There we go. And check out how the text is sort of wrapping. That's fine. We can go to our text. And actually, I think this is a function of the style. So let me jump into the style here. What do we got going on here? Okay, yes. So right now, we want it to be auto width. We don't want it to just be auto height. We want it to say whatever width it is, make the text the same size. So we'll click that, and the text now automatically becomes that size, which is nice. And in a, not too long of a job, we generated random images and names as a really good placeholder for the actual content. Before I go, the last section we're going to cover is exporting. Was there any questions specifically around this before I move forward?
So during the export, when you have it exported, is that the time where you can actually fill these in with the true data instead of being placeholders?
I would say it kind of depends on where you're using this. So if you're going to show this design to somebody and they needed to have real data, then you would do that in Figma. But really what we're using this for is a reference or a blueprint for when we code. So once we code, then we can maybe have a JSON file or a database that has the real data in there and use this as a guide to how are we going to design it out, how we're going to style things.
Gotcha.
G, like that transition effect between like the background and the hero image, did you make that in Figma too, or did you use another thing and just import it over?
Sure. So with this was done with two programs. So Photoshop I used to resize the image.
Okay.
I downloaded from Unsplash, which is a free royalty-free repository. Resized it in Photoshop to get it be web optimized, and then I added it as a fill in the background, but then added another fill of a gradient, linear gradient, and that's giving us that sort of fade out effect. So the bottom is 100% opacity, and the top is a 80% opacity of the same color. And then the background is just a solid opacity. So if I change the background here of this frame to something else, that's what that is. Wow. And that's kind of how it's helpful to think about how do we create this in React, because maybe now that says, okay, we have a frame here. Now we could, coding this, we have two sort of avenues to take. We can actually just export this image. We'll see how to do that in a moment with all the styling applied just on the image, which may be fine, but maybe we want to have a little more control in the future of changing that gradient. So we can actually export in another way, which I'll show everybody, just the image itself, and then do the layout with do the gradient with CSS, which is also great. There's also an easy way of exporting that separately. And then that gives us additional functionality later on. And then maybe we create a component called main or something that holds all this information and apply the background color to that one component, which is what is the container for all of this. And that's kind of something we can strategize in Figma before actually coding anything. If it takes us long, for me, I find it easier to think visually, move things around than do it in code. So it can be helpful in that way.
And then, can I ask another question?
Please go for it.
Yeah. So, do you have a tool that that helps you pick a color scheme?
Absolutely, yes. So there are many great tools out there. One that I'm using currently is called, I always forget the name of it, a cooler color. Here it is. It's called coolers.co. I'll shoot it in the.
Oh, I have that one. Yeah, that one is pretty cool. That's pretty rad that you use that. Yeah,
it's a great way to start. For anyone who hasn't seen this one yet, it randomly generates colors with the space bar. And as you find colors, you can lock them down and create color palettes. It's a great way to start off. And there is hex codes here, and you can create tints to quickly create it. And then what's great is like, okay, this is a great color scheme. Well, now I can come to my design system and create all those colors at the beginning of the project, and then now start applying them to the project. So I kind of came up with this color palette ahead of time. I actually only came up with like maybe two of the colors, this text and this background. And then as I was designing, realizing, I need more color for highlights and for other elements, I started adding to my color system. The goal is to not have sort of orphan colors that don't belong anywhere, just floating around, because then if I want to do a massive change, like, changing this text everywhere, it's going to be really hard to do that if there are colors that are not assigned to anything. Another really good resource is Adobe Color. formerly known as Adobe Cooler with a K. This, you actually don't need to have Adobe account for this. Colors are usually, in design, are usually based in art, I guess, as well, around what's called a 12-step color wheel, which is this. And they have these principles of how do you pair color together that looks visually nice. So the principles are monochromatic, triad, complementary, and these other ones down here. But for example, a complementary color scheme is two colors at the opposite end of the color wheel that can look nice together. So if I want to, you know, this sort of magenta or dark pink with this green kind of looks nice. So it's a great way of creating that. Or if let's say I want a monochromatic color scheme, I can click monochromatic and now it's grabbing the same hue, color's hue, but different saturations and tints. So tints are, and shades are, I believe it's light and dark versus saturation is how much is a color versus black and white. It's just creating variations on that. So it's sometimes nice to, you know, maybe you come up with a color palette in the Cooler website, but then maybe you're like, you know, I need a really good complementary color to this, something on the opposite end of the spectrum. You can throw that color into Adobe Cooler, Adobe Color, and it'll generate out, based on the color wheel, a nice color palette, nice color scheme.
That's rad. That's pretty cool.
I'll shoot this one also.
It's so dope how organized you are. Like that's something that I think that's the biggest takeaway for me from this whole thing is it's like, oh shit, like there are levels to the game. Like you really snapped on that design one, but also like how you created it is really sick.
Thank you. It's something that comes with just sort of time working through this. It's sometimes hard to see that when we're working on, you know, sort of small team projects or class or homeworks. It's definitely helpful in that area, but think about when you're going to get a job. You may be in a team of 10 people, you may be on a team of 30 or 40 people. Some of them may be account managers, they may be developers and designers, but they all need access to various levels to the product, which is the design. So having a way to really streamline and have a consistent language can be really helpful. Showing this sort of at a larger scale. Let me see if I can pull up an example of a larger design system here. So this is a template I created at my last job for some of the work we're doing. So this is not populated, but this is an example of a larger design system. So it comes with documentation of how to use it, so anybody can sort of just go ahead and jump in with resources. There's different grids that can be used, spacers, colors, text, buttons, components, navigation, icons, effects. And this is just a starting point. So for example, with a client, the site has many sites. There's different sites that are in their portfolio. So we have different design systems that are applied, and we may have 40 different projects going on with them, whether they're email blasts or websites or whatever, what have you, but they all have to have a central repository that we can find that information. A really cool part about, it's unfortunately not part of the free Figma package or account, but components go into what's called an asset panel, which is on the left. This is where we can access all of those components that we created. Right now, because we're using a free account, it's local. It's just applied to this local, not just this project, but it's local to the overall sort of account. But if we're a part of a team, we can actually put this all in the cloud, and then anybody can access those styles or components and use them across various projects, which just speeds up the process so much more. So lastly, I want to talk a little bit about exporting and sharing. What do we do with all of this? So for the most part, we're sort of, you know, our last project we're doing together, and really we're using this as a blueprint and a fast way to prototype and communicate ideas with each other before we're going ahead and then coding it. So that's a really big pull for why we're using this, but it's also a way of jump starting our code. So we can go ahead and export out assets. So I would never recommend exporting out text as like a PNG or an SVG, because there's something called SEO, search engine optimization, and Google really likes to read the text. It gets a lot of context of your page by what your text says. So if you're exporting out an image or a SVG file, you can't actually read it. It doesn't know what it says. And it doesn't get the benefit of using semantic code. So like an H1 versus an H2, an H1 has more emphasis to Google than an H2 does. It understands that context. So we wouldn't necessarily want to export that out, but we can export an image out. And we were talking about before, if I click on this image, I can come down to export and I can select what size do I want. So one time size will give me a pixel that's 1500 pixels by 254, but I can 4 times that if I wanted to, and really export that out to be a lot larger. And where that can be valuable is Retina display. If you want to 2x it, and quickly create different sized files in one click of a button. Also, if you're doing like some sort of presentation, like for example, maybe we're going to do a presentation for projects, we're designing a mobile layout that is designed pretty small. Like let's say we want to show this. Let's go here. We want to show this layout here. This card is not that big. It's 297 pixels wide by 514. It looks really nice because it's rendering it as in Figma. But if I zoom out to 100%, that's sort of how big it's going to be. So maybe for presentation purposes, I want to export that out at a 4 times scale, so it'll be sharp on PowerPoint, right? So we can do that. We can change the name, the suffix it gives it. So it's the way it kind of works is it takes the layer name. So this one's right now called rectangle 1, but maybe we call it, or actually, I'm sorry, it's going to be, no, it will be this one. So we call this Hero BG. And I'm already trying to think about how is this going to live in my code. So I'm going to give it hyphens and all lowercase. So that way I don't have to rename it after the fact. And then when I export it, it's going to be called Hero-BG, the background. And if it's 2 times, we can specify a suffix that goes at the end. So it'll be Hero-BG at 2 times. And that's going to be part of the file name. And then we can choose, do we want it to be a PNG, a JPEG, an SVG, or a PDF, the file format. I recommend not to use PNGs for anything. I believe TJ probably mentioned this in class. Anything that doesn't have alpha transparency. So for example, this image here, note how it fits in a rectangle. Oops, sorry. So these areas inside the rectangle will be transparent, has things showing through, whereas this image here is just a square. It's a rectangle. There's no transparency that would happen. So this would be a great time to use a PNG because we want to take advantage of that transparency, but this has no purpose. So we can do a JPEG, and PNGs usually are a little bit larger in file size than JPEGs. So why not save a couple, even if it's a couple of kilobytes where we can, by strategically exporting them out correctly. SVGs are really powerful. So for logos, when we want to export out that logo, this logo actually was even designed in Figma because it has basically the same base tools that Illustrator does. But for icons, we can export those out as SVGs, taking advantage of that vector file format. And then PDFs, to be honest, I wouldn't use that in here. Figma does not do a good job of exporting out optimized PDFs. They're usually really large. What I would expect to be like a 3 megabyte PDF will oftentimes be 20 or 30 megabytes, which is uneasy to handle. If you really want to use a PDF, I'd actually recommend exporting out a JPEG at a larger file format size, so maybe like 4 times the size, and then after the fact, converting it to a PDF. And I use Adobe Acrobat Pro, which I don't believe the free version can transfer to PDFs. Maybe it can, but I think there's online resources that can change a JPEG to a PDF. So that's one way to export out files. If we're trying to showcase this to somebody, we can hit the share button and either add them as viewers, or if we want to pay, have them paid users to this account, or we can do copy link, and we want to make sure that anyone with this link can view it if we want it to be public. And then I'll just share this out to resources, share out a link, and then now anybody can access this and view it. And you guys can even jump in and see kind of the presentation here. What's really cool though is check out, we get a button here that says get embed code. So we can actually embed this whole Figma file on our portfolios. It won't show all of the things here, but it'll essentially be if I can find it, it'll basically be this screen embedded in our portfolio, and there's going to be a little button that'll show up on the bottom right that lets people expand it. So if you have something already designed in Figma, I mean, it makes your portfolio, elevates your portfolio to that next level, showing that the process that you took and the processes that your team took to work through the problem before you came and coded it. And that's great for, like in my last job, I managed a team of designers and developers. And when a developer would come and say, hey, I know Sketch or I know Figma, that is more of a reason that why I'd want to bring him onto my team, because he's going to know how to, or she's going to know how to work through problems that the designers on my team are going to work through, and make that communication so much easier, even if they're not an expert at Figma or Sketch. But it helps show that they can really work well in a team. So, excuse me. So that's the share. What's really cool, the last sort of thing we'll look at before we take any more questions is, excuse me, there's two panels here called prototype and code. Prototype is really awesome. I mentioned earlier, I'm not going to cover it here because it's sort of another hour and a half we can go into about that. I've also not used it too much in Figma. I used it more in Vision, but it's essentially a way that we can actually add click states, hovers, modals, all this sort of coded functionality without actually coding anything. So if we have a big client, we want to show something really cool in our portfolio and have it embedded, we can, before we touch any code, actually plan out those functionality and even some micro animations, like having things slide over and whatnot in Figma, which is really powerful. But what I really want to focus on was the code section. So going back to a couple of other things people asked about is, can we generate code? So we actually can. We can go ahead and click on an element and check out how it's giving us CSS properties, which is really nice. It doesn't know too much about contextually where it's going to be, so it's giving us some positioning, but we don't necessarily, I wouldn't recommend just clicking and dragging and copying all this because it may not be what you're trying to do. Where it really comes into play, excuse me, is for things like gradients. Check out how it just exported out this gradient for us, all the values, which is really nice. So we can just grab this, and then we can go to a resource like a few of them out there, if I can spell. Gradient generator. This is a really nice one. It's actually done by the same company that does the Cooler site. I'll shoot this over as well. And we can go ahead and grab the values from this Figma gradient and then check out how it gives us all the Webpack information. So it works on Safari and all these other areas. So we have now a starting point to just chuck into our code without actually typing all this stuff out, which is really nice. It also does a great job with drop shadows, or what we call in CSS box shadows. So there's that box shadow code, all what do you call it again? All written out for us, and then we can use a similar program or similar service like box shadow generator by CSS-matic. I'll shoot that as well out, and do the same process. Put in our initial values, and then it'll generate out for us all the Webpack information. And one other way to sort of end this panel is, actually, sorry, two things. One is for our components, we can actually give them information. So for example, this is actually really good for font awesome stuff. Like if we wanted to go ahead and say, you know what, this font awesome has a code. I forget what this one is, but it's a FA pin. And that way the developer, whether it's yourself or someone else, can actually find out what is that exact code. And then let's say we go to code and click on that, we now have comments about that component, which is really nice. So we don't actually need to have a paid account. You can just jump into as long as you're part of the account as a free person, a free user. You can come in and just grab a lot of really powerful information right off the bat. And then finally, so we can export this image out, like we saw before, as a PNG with the alpha transparency around it. So if I go to export, do it as a PNG. That looks good. I'm going to do export out here. And let my computer think for a little bit. Or let it think for a long time. And know how it's grabbing the layer name. Maybe that's not exactly what I wanted. I'm going to check in downloads, so I'll just rename it here. So profile alpha, I'll just call it, and save. And then if I come down to that, check out how it is preserving those alpha transparencies. It's actually showing up as a circle, which is nice. But maybe I don't want that. Maybe I want it to actually just be the base file that's underneath it. And maybe, I added in a little gradient there and whatnot. Maybe I added in a shadow as well. And I don't necessarily want all this because I want to do this all with CSS. So I can still come in here and go to code. And then there's 2 toggles on the left and right. If I click on the second toggle that has 3 lines, the table, it gives me that same information with some more. And it actually, if it's an image, it'll give me a little link that I can click. And it'll generate on Figma servers your original image with no cropping, no styles, nothing. Resize there. So 2 really powerful ways of getting imagery from Figma for our projects. There's some more information here for that as well, in addition to tutorials for each of these. So anything that has this sort of little arrow here within the frame is a link that has how do you use each of these sections. So guys, I know we went well over the 1 hour that I anticipated, but if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer. And if not, thank you so much for joining. I hope this was educational and helpful in our projects.